Hello, I'm Michael Shaw, and this is the rights of LGBTQIA plus Americans, government protections and limitations. Who are the LGBTQ plus peoples? As defined in our textbook, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, and those questioning their sexual identity. Included in this classification are people who identify as non-binary, meaning they do not see themselves as either male or female. This movement was inspired by the civil rights movement, which was going on at the same time. Discrimination in the 1900s through the 1960s. In 1924, the first human rights organization was opened in Chicago, Illinois. It was really the first gay rights organization in America. Unfortunately, due to political pressure, it was disbanded. In 1950, the historically homophobic Eisenhower administration takes office. This administration signed many acts stripping the rights from LGBTQ peoples. For example, the Executive Order 10450 banning homosexuals from working for the federal government or any of its private contractors. At this time, the American Psychiatric Association put sexuality on their list of mental disorders. Significant events like the creation of the National Transsexual Counseling Unit, Illinois repealing its sodomy laws, and the landmark Inc. versus Olsling case, which defended a gay newspaper's right of the First Amendment, freedom of speech. Pride found in the Stonewall riots. On June 28, 1969, riots broke out at the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village. Quote, angry gay youth clash with aggressive police officers in the streets, leading to a 3-day riot. The event will be credited with reigniting the fire behind America's modern LGBTQ rights movement. After this event, the movement takes a completely different turn. They're fighting for actual civil rights instead of being treated awfully, especially by these police officers in this case. After the riots, many organizations were formed which helped to organize the movement into something bigger. In the time period post-Eisenhower and Stonewall, this helped to define the LGBTQ community today. The Lambda Legal Organization was formed in 1970, which sole purpose was to fight for the civil rights of the LGBTQ community. A large legal victory was achieved on December 15th, 1973. The ABA voted to remove homosexuality from its list of mental disorders. As well at this time, Kathy Kozanchenko was selected into public office in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and was a part of the LGBTQ community. Later in the 70s, resistance to the movement is felt in religious states in the South that would want to move LGBTQ people out of their area. And the assassination of Harvey Milk was devastating for the community, as he was a big part of the movement. During the 1980s, LGBTQ peoples gained back rights previously taken away in the 50s and 60s. Large legal victories allocated for basic equal rights, as stated in American Democracy Now, quote, during the 1980s, a number of states and local governments adopted laws prohibiting discrimination in employment, housing, public accommodations, and employee benefits, end quote. As well, at this time, Wisconsin and even the Democratic Committee stated that there would be no discrimination in their states or in who they hire for the committee. There were laws implemented against same-sex intercourse between two consenting adults. Revolutionary cases such as Bowers versus Hardwick was actually in defense of Georgia's sodomy laws. One event dominates the 80s and 90s, though, for the LGBTQ community, and frankly, a lot of people throughout America. And it's the insurgence of the disease named AIDS. This disease was rampant in the LGBTQ community, but it actually helped bring them closer together because the current administration at the time, under Ronald Reagan, did nothing to help the community in turmoil. So they gathered for riots outside the Capitol and pushed for rights and anti-discrimination for the people who were affected by this disease. In the early 90s, President George Bush signs the Ryan White Care Act that helped federal funding of programs supporting those living with AIDS. Ryan White was a significant figure in the AIDS community as he contracted the disease off of a bad, I guess, doctor visit. He was getting a hepatitis shot. This disease to some people felt like it was caused by the LGBT community. And so lots of hate and discrimination was put towards them at this time. Legal victories in the 90s. In the 1993, the Department of Defense issues the policy known as Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which basically was a policy prohibiting the action of barring applicants from service based on their sexual orientation, meaning that if the government doesn't ask and the person doesn't tell their sexuality, then they won't have to bar them from service, which was kind of taken 50-50 by most people. But for the LGBTQ community, it was a way of snuffing out the flame of being you. In 1996, Colorado's Second Amendment, which denied gays and lesbians protections against discrimination, was declared unconstitutional. A big loss for the LGBT community as well was when the Defense of Marriage Act was signed in 1996 by the Clinton administration. It gave it a definition of between a man and a woman. At the turn of the century, Vermont was the very first state to legalize partnerships between same-sex couples. Later on, Massachusetts became the first state to legalize gay marriage, and many followed suit. A major victory for the LGBTQ community at this time was Lawrence versus Texas in 2003, which ruled Texas's sodomy laws unconstitutional. President Obama ascended into the office in 2008, and his administration repeals the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy and does not defend the Defense of Marriage Act. He signs multiple acts that aim to prevent hate crimes and allocates rights to federal employees in same-sex marriages. The modern LGBTQ community, legal losses and victories. Obergefell versus Hodges was a massive case for the community, as it legalized same-sex marriage in all 50 states. Furthermore, as stated in American Democracy Now!, the 14th Amendment protects the right to marry as a fundamental liberty for same-sex couples identically to opposite-sex couples. In 2020, Bostic versus Clayton County ruled that it was discrimination to prohibit a person from a job based on their sexual identity in the private work sector. So not only would LGBTQ people be able to not be discriminated in federal government, but also the private work sector, which was an amazing case as well. Though religious liberty laws allowed for discrimination against LGBTQ people based on beliefs due to religion. Hate crimes and mental instability. During COVID and the 2020 pandemic, many people were affected by what was going on. The LGBTQ community was not spared. More than 1 in 3 LGBTQ Americans face discrimination in some kind in the past year. Hate crimes have left many dead throughout the country. In fact, 41 in 2021. People who identify as transgender are targeted and affected the most by discrimination in America, with 62% reporting discrimination in the past year. Transgender laws regarding minors was implemented by certain states, talking about how they shouldn't be playing sports or have these ideas of transgender in their head at a young age, which many people did not agree with. As well as LGBTQ plus Americans tend to hide their lives because they might be too scared to come out in that environment. This has also turned into a semi-political war. The movement has been boiling since the 60s and is still fighting for someone to stand up to protect them. Many Democrat states have done this for their people. Earlier this year, President Donald Trump, in his rapid completion of the Project 2025, signed an executive order that threatened to cut federal funding from providers offering gender-affirming care to people under the age of 19. But also in 2023, our Governor J.B. Pritzker signed into law a measure that farther protects access to gender-affirming care and reproductive health care in Illinois. So Illinois is for LGBTQ plus community, and they are willing to protect them from whatever is coming in the next 4 years. In conclusion, this 60-decade long movement has done a lot. They have gone from being prosecuted and discriminated in the 50s under Eisenhower to where they are now. Hopefully these laws protecting them will not be reverted by the current administration, but also large court case victories like Obergefell versus Hodges, as well as Bostic versus Clayton County, have been ruled and are in favor of the LGBTQ community. The repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell allowed for LGBTQ plus Americans to freely participate in our armed forces and defend the country that they love. But political polarization has had an immense effect on the movement, though more and more people want to defend their fellow human beings.